Thanks for tuning in to Mundo Blue. Today, I'm on my way out to talk to Jame Saur with Dirt Don't Hurt. And I gotta say, I love that name. Dirt Don't Hurt is clever. So, we're going to find out about composting and some of the myths that go along with it. Hope you'll tune in. Hi, welcome to Mundo Blue. Today we're with Jame Saur, and she has Dirt Don't Hurt composting. And we have talked about composting before on this program, but we've never had anybody show us how to put together a compost pile, what's involved, and I mean, it has to be done perfectly, right, Jame?
That is the common myth, and in my company, Dirt Don't Hurt, one of the main things I do is compost consultation. So I'm teaching people about compost, and the main thing that I have to teach is myth busting.
I think that's very important, right?
Yeah, the number one myth is that it has to be perfect, that there's this ratio of green to brown and you have to get all scientific on the numbers and add this and do that and measure everything. The truth of it is, compost just happens.
Okay, well then tell us about it.
So the easiest way to compost, if you wanted to get just started immediately today with composting and make excellent, earth-friendly, safe, pathogen-free compost, the best way to do it is to dig a hole in the ground and put your scraps in it.
Because that's pretty simple.
All we're doing with all these compost bins and piles and tumblers and all of these things is basically recreating what's happening under the ground with all the life and the microorganisms that live there, that have the ability through their natural enzymes to break down the food waste back into nutrition for the earth to feed the plants with.
Okay,
So,
I'm going to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to let you know that that thing came sliding down.
I hope it's not too windy for your audio. I was just thinking about that.
No, I don't think so, because it's fairly quiet in here, and I've really gotten a good lesson on audio
Okay.
by filming next to a river and having wind blow like crazy. So,
I was gonna film us or have us do it in the front yard, but that one tree is like really loud when the wind goes through it. So, yeah, I think this is better.
okay.
So
What do you have there? I mean, paper bags and...
yeah, so I have a few different kind of basic composting models or setups, composters, whatever word you want to use for it. Besides the hole in the ground method, there's a bunch of different methods, and it really just depends on your lifestyle, how much waste you are creating, whether it's just from you cooking, or if you have animals, or if you have a garden or a yard, or more and more. And each system is designed around the volume. So if you have a high volume amount of waste, say animals, yard, garden, this is my number one preferred setup. It's called a geobin. It can literally be built out of anything that allows air to pass through it. So you can build it out of sticks, literally whatever you have. That's the best way to do it. Use what you already have. Don't be buying new stuff. We can always reuse everything we have. And the geobin is a great way to allow proper airflow for large compost setups. That's the number one problem, is not having enough airflow through the system. And that's not added by constantly turning it. That's another myth. Compost is too hard because I constantly have to turn it. Compost doesn't really like to be turned that often. So let's get that excuse out of the way. Now we have less excuses to compost. But if you had this type of system, because you had a large amount of green waste, you need it to be primarily full of carbons, which is great because we need to do everything we can to re-sequester the carbon back into the soil where it needs to be. So you'd need a large volume of carbon, which can be all kinds of things from paper, cardboard, egg cartons, paper towel rolls, newspaper, junk mail. The list goes on and on. And you would fill this bin up, allow the system to work, essentially. Depending on the type of ingredients that you've added, there'll be slightly different steps, or it might take slightly different amount of time depending on where you are. You might need slightly more water or slightly less. That's all stuff that like a compost consultation can help you with. But this kind of system could make complete compost for you in as little as, I'll say 3 months to be on the safe side. And that means it's gone through every stage it needs to go through. The worms have come in, there's been a fungal flush, and you're going to have the healthy, richest, most nutrient-rich compost that you can using a system like this. This cannot be achieved in those plastic tumbler bins. I know those are very attractive. It seems like fun. It is fun, but like I said, compost really doesn't like being turned that often. So unfortunately, those tumblers, I like to call them maybe like a pre-compost storage. Say if you have a worm bin or something like that for someone that has a smaller amount of waste that they're producing, worm bins are an excellent way to compost. You can make a worm bin in anything from a coffee can size to a 55-gallon drum, but it's essentially no smell, hands off. You really never turn it. If you want to harvest the castings out for your garden, that's going to be the most of your maintenance. So you could pre-compost in those tumblers for the worm bins, but the tumblers themselves, I think, were designed by someone with a good intention, but also someone that has never actually composted or understands the nature of it. Unfortunately, they meant well, thank you, but I wish that they would stop being in existence, honestly. There's so many better ways to compost besides those bins.
Now, one thing I want to touch on that you talked about was the build a worm bin. Or,
yeah.
How'd you put it? Is that what you said?
Yep.
So how would somebody do that?
Okay, so the most simple way to do it, I'll just give you an example. You could use any size container you have. I just grabbed this one. You can, like I said, you could even use a coffee canister. So imagine this, whatever size bin you're imagining or that you would use. You would take any kind of paper product and try to shred it up or rip it up, cut it up as best as you can, and add maybe about, say, 1/4 of the container of the shredded paper. And then that paper needs to be wetted down in some way. And the best way to do it, in my opinion, is by making what I call a worm marinade. So you take all your food scraps and put them in the blender with some rainwater or some kind of non-acidic juice, give it a good whirl, and then you soak that into the paper shreds just until when you pick up the paper shreds and squeeze them, you get like 5 to 10 drops of water coming out between your fingers there. If you squeeze it and it's like a bunch, you need to add more shredded paper. If you squeeze it and nothing comes out, add more of the marinade. At that point, let it sit just to be safe, like overnight, because what's happening there is it's a little bit of pre-composting. The material can start to warm up in that initial stage, and worms really don't like being very warm, so you want to let it go through its little peak first. Then you add your buddies in there. So with that, the amount of worms is going to depend on the size container. So say if you were using a coffee cup, you'd want to add about initially like 1/8 of the volume of the coffee mug or whatever small container. Probably about 1/8 of the volume, and then about every 60 days, if the environment is kept healthy with the amount of correct food and water, they'll double their population roughly every about 60 days. So you shouldn't have to ever buy worms again. They will literally reproduce forever for you and continue to compost for you forever.
Now, you were talking about myth busting.
Oh yeah.
And when we met, I was at that time under the impression that you can't compost meat,
right,
or meat products or dairy,
right,
or anything like that. And you said, nope, that's not true.
Right.
And so I love I love it when I'm wrong and there's a
too.
good piece of information
Yeah.
because you get to learn more.
Exactly.
So talk about how can you compost meat, because it doesn't, in my brain, it doesn't fit, you know, it doesn't work.
Right. So let's think about it this way. Everything, absolutely, that comes from Earth can go back into it.
Okay.
So what happens to a deer when it dies in a field and nothing comes along to eat it? It composts.
Of course.
The life in the soil comes out and eats it. So why you hear don't compost meat and dairy is because if it's composted improperly, it can cause a bunch of problems. Number one, it could smell and attract critters into your yard. Number two, it could grow dangerous pathogens instead of breaking down into healthy soil that you want to use in your garden, right? These are dangerous, scary things. They're not that scary. That's another myth, that there's scary things. So what happens when you compost these things? There's a number of ways that you can compost them in your home backyard system. Number one way would be to bury it in a hole in the ground, because that's the number one way to make sure that all the pathogens are removed. Number two would be to run it through a hot composting cycle, which does involve, I wouldn't say so much science as it does a lot of observation and record keeping to make your system stay on track. And what happens during that cycle is a very specific set of organisms move through at specific sets of time, and in the end result is that all the nasty pathogens, E. coli, all those gross things that come from the dairies and meats, have been consumed by those microorganisms and pooped out into good healthy stuff that's fine for us. The third way to make sure that the meats and dairies, things that you're composting, are safe, is to use, there's one microorganism that can do it absolutely on their own without the assistance of anyone else. The worms!
Really?
Yeah. Worms can eat like diesel fuel. Worms can eat some pretty crazy, powerful things and be able to pass them through.
They just like to eat.
They are incredible repairers of our earth.
Wow.
So, yeah, there's many ways that you can compost meat and dairy safely, but there are ways that it would be an unsafe way. So if you want to compost meat and dairy, I would say look into fermentation using bokashi. I think that's what we talked about at the market. That's just one way. There's a number of different fermentation methods. I like bokashi because it's really easy to use. You kind of set it and forget it, kind of one of those things. I could go on talking about bokashi for another 30 minutes. Call me, text me if you want some help. But yeah, there's a number of ways to compost the meat and dairy safely. On more, sustainable, non-traditional farms, if an animal were to pass unexpectedly, they would, take one of their compost windrows, that's just the bedding and the manure, dig a hole in it, put the animal in there, and bury it back up. And that's how they take care of it, instead of having to pay to someone come have the animal hauled off or use big machinery to dig holes. And within a year, that animal is completely gone. You wouldn't know that they were ever there.